COVID camps coming to the United States. This is a USA Today article. This is from a couple months ago, but it's going to be used to juxtapose some of the contextual history we have prepared for you in the rest of this evening's journey. And then we'll see who's got it on screen for us to analyze.
The USA Today fact check. Quarantine camps are real, but COVID-19 camp claim stretches truth. This was posted on August 9th, 2020. And the claim is the U.S. military has approved COVID-19 quarantine camps that will access personal information and be monitored by militarized CDC police. It starts here. Early in the coronavirus pandemic, the Department of Defense approval of military facilities for quarantine use was theorized to be much more than a public health effort. And then it references a Instagram post, a coming digital 5G biometric tracking surveillance checkpoint service that accesses your entire data from financial status, tax history, social credit score, social media ranking, watch history, sexual preference, political views will be monitored, and armed militarized CDC police will determine who is desirable for society and who goes to camp. Later goes on to say that that Instagram account stated that his claim was mostly my own personal sarcastic speculation, and I'm being a bit hyperbolic as well. So quite a bit of history of quarantines that don't correlate with the current COVID. In February, the Department of Defense approved a request from the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the CDC, for possible use of military facilities to quarantine Americans returning from overseas, particularly evacuees from Wuhan, China, and passengers of the Grand Princess cruise ship. And then here it actually lays out some facts. While 11 bases were approved at the time of the Daily Mail article cited in the Instagram post, this was later expanded to 15. So I'm pretty sure that's what they were trying to fact check right there, and it just laid it out. And then
they're letting you know you don't have individual rights when they invoke quarantine.
Pretty much. At present, most isolations and quarantine measures are split among federal, state authorities, and roughly 2,800 local public health departments. According to Stat News, the CDC does retain the authority to detain, medically examine, and release persons arriving into the United States and traveling between states who are suspected of carrying these communicable diseases. And then it goes on for their ruling. It's partly false. So we
nothing to see here.
We rate the claim that the U.S. military has approved COVID-19 quarantine camps that will access personal information and be monitored by military CDC policies as partly false, because some of it is not supported by our research. While it is true that 11 military facilities were approved as quarantine bases, these sites were meant to be temporary and are not true quarantine stations. The federal government has some authority to institute a large-scale quarantine. Quarantine measures are still at the discretion of state and local health departments. Law enforcement agencies may help enforce federal quarantine orders, but the CDC itself is not militarized. There's no evidence to suggest personal information is or will be accessed at quarantine stations. So they pretty much put those Instagram posts in the beginning as a straw man to cover.
Yeah. That's clever Cyborg too. Now you're starting to see like the people that put out and purvey the Cyborg. You got USA Today, right? And they're spinning a little tail. And then in the fact check, they're like, hey, by the way, it's not 11 bases, it's 15 quarantine centers that are real, but not according to the straw man that they put up top. So they can say it's partly false. Nothing to see here. And I'm not saying there's anything to say there. I'm just going to show you it's not the only country that's setting up quarantine camps. And then we're going to look at the history of how some of these camps evolve, because once they set them up, they don't necessarily take them down. Just because it's set up as temporary doesn't mean that, the parts of the Berlin Wall were set up to be temporary. Okay. So you have to look at what's going on today and juxtapose it to what do we know about history in similar political regimes as that which is taking hold and forming in this country. So let's go ahead. Is there the camps? No, the Daily Mail.
Is a Daily Mail post. U.S. military approves 11 coronavirus quarantine camps next to major U.S. airports, which can treat up to 1,000 people, as the 13th American case is confirmed in California. The Pentagon is setting up 11 quarantine camps on military bases near major
The Pentagon.
cities.
We heard about them earlier in this show. Okay. So the people that made the thing that made the vaccine for the thing now bring you the camp for the thing. Okay. Now, they got COVID camps in China. Now let's look at that story to see, because they, what happens in China tends to come here through this COVID pandemic. So let's see what, oh my goodness. Jeez. You thought it was a lot when they set up those hospitals real quick back a year ago. Now look at what they got going on. I don't know. We're going to get into China, and do they have a good history with the camps that they already run? Now they're building new camps for people. And how long before those types of camps start camping out in America? All right. So go ahead and read the title, get a date.
We got China builds massive COVID-19 quarantine camp for 4,000 people as outbreak continues, posted January 21st of 2021.
So that's like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. It's an awful lot for 4,000 people.
Rushing to build a massive quarantine camp that can house more than 4,000 people after an outbreak of COVID this month has left tens of millions of people under strict lockdown.
I bet the Chinese party hates that lockdown.
The provincial capital of Hebei, which surrounds the country's capital, Beijing.
So it's just right around the capital. Okay, it's not in some far off place in China like the Uyghur camps. All right, so now that we've heard about the camps in America, the camps in China that are being used for COVID, let's just look at the history of camps like they're setting up right now in Chinese history. We've got a short video explaining this history. It's by a young fellow named Jake Tran, and it's going to give you some insights on how a lot of the things that you might even own are being produced these days, especially now in the COVID marketplace, where they have brought in people from camps in order to fill in on assembly lines as they've locked the rest of the citizens down. That's how they're continuing production. All right, so let's go ahead and roll this clip from Jake Tran, and we're going to learn about the Uyghur camps. You might even call them concentration camps. They're definitely used for slave labor camps, we'll call them, until we learn more. Let's hear it.
So you're the heads of China. It's a well-known fact that you have the ambitions to take over the world, and you're growing at a very fast rate. One of the ways you're funding your goal of world domination is with your Belt and Road Initiative, a plan to make it easier for anyone to trade with China by creating a modern-day Silk Road of railroads, highways, electricity grids, seaports, and much more by partnering with nearly 70 countries. Because you're growing so much, your energy demands for electricity, oil, etc. are higher than ever, and it's only gonna keep growing. But then you run into a problem. The original Silk Road that connected China with the rest of the world runs through an area of China called Xinjiang, China's gateway into the Western world by land. Xinjiang is also home to a ton of natural resources that you desperately need if you ever hope of achieving your goals. It has nearly 40% of your coal reserves, 25% of your gas reserves, so in a way, Xinjiang is your most important piece of land. Now at first glance, this is great because Xinjiang is already a part of China, but beneath the surface, however, things aren't all that well and dandy. See, unlike the majority of China, Xinjiang is home to an ethnic Muslim minority called the Uyghurs. They look different from the Han Chinese, the ethnic majority of China. They speak a different language than the rest of China, but most importantly, they have a completely different culture than the rest of China, a culture that is much more similar to the neighboring Turkish countries than to the Chinese. Now you're not dumb. You know that a society's culture is the root of everything. The Chinese culture that you've worked so hard to maintain is what allows you to rule over your plebs in the first place. But then comes along these disloyal outsiders with a completely different culture that threatens your entire scheme. If this minority doesn't feel like they're a part of Chinese culture, they could become separatists and want to form their own independent nation like they have in the past, effectively throwing a giant monkey wrench into your plans by taking control of your most important piece of territory.
And the central government has long regarded this ethnic minority community, predominantly Uyghurs, as disloyal.
So it's pretty safe to say that if you don't do something about this little issue we have here, everything falls apart. You need to crush the Uyghurs' alien culture. You need to brainwash them into being dependent on the ruling class. You need to make them Chinese. And what better way to do so than with the time-tested method of concentration camps?
It looks like a Nazi playbook to me.
Zenz estimates up to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities have been sent to the camps since 2017.
This is a story they don't want to get out.
We would call that brainwashing.
没有那个完全改变他们的思想，我们就是为了让他们思想上的极端这个因素去除掉。
It's probably the largest internment of an ethnic or religious minority since the Holocaust.
Now you've been aware of this problem for a while, but you can't just all of a sudden build a concentration camp and start throwing people into it. No. If you want change, you gotta ease people into that change. In fact, you, the government, have already been incentivizing your native Han Chinese to migrate into Xinjiang since the 50s to ever so slowly dilute their culture. And although it did work, the Han Chinese now make up almost exactly as many Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The Uyghur people aren't as docile as you once thought. And in 2009, those disloyal outsiders finally thought that they had enough and erupted into violent riots against the Han Chinese. Now, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know that when there's a crisis, there's a sweet opportunity. So here's what you do. By now, you know that concentration camps are really the only option left. But things are pretty heated right now, and although you can just detain everyone, it would be a logistics nightmare and would cause a lot more controversy than needed. So you gotta calm things down and figure out a way to ID the people committing thought crimes by turning Xinjiang into a tyrant's dream. You cry like these people are extremists, that they're infected with religious extremism, and that you need to flood the city with police and 24-hour surveillance to keep the peace. Now, whether or not there's any truth to this, it doesn't matter. It's all part of the plan. Have police stations, guards, and armored vehicles on every corner. Condition and exhaust everyone by making them go through security checkpoints for each and every aspect of their daily lives.
To be in Xinjiang means being checked every day, multiple times a day. When you go to a market, when you drive a car, when you take a train.
Check their phones at these checkpoints to make sure they haven't committed any thought crimes by having the wrong app installed.
Rakima Senbei, who now lives in Kazakhstan, spent more than a year in the Chinese camp system just for having WhatsApp on her phone.
And since you have such a good excuse for all of this protecting the public, you can use this as a testing ground for the most futuristic surveillance equipment before rolling it out to the rest of China. Meaning you can easily make the lives of dissenters and minorities very difficult.
Residents have different levels of freedom based on factors like ethnicity and religious practices.
You can prevent retaliation by tying the purchase of kitchen knives to people's IDs by laser etching a QR code on the potential weapon. But most importantly, you can use this stateless police presence to categorize people as safe, regular, or unsafe. There are a few ways you can do this. You can force everyone to fill out surveys about themselves and their beliefs. When that doesn't work, you can just rely on analyzing people's movements on surveillance cameras with AI to see who's walking too fast, who's parked in the wrong spot, who jaywalked. And of course, you can rely on just good old-fashioned police intuition. Once you do categorize people, well, we obviously can't have people deemed unsafe roaming the streets now, can we? So what do? You round them up and move on to the step we've all been waiting for, our good old concentration camps. Now that we have our advanced police state up and we singled out all the troublemakers, it's time to start building the concentration camps. But here's the problem, the idealists in the West would never approve of such inhumane tactics because of the history associated with them. Now you know you're not gonna go that far, at least not yet. You're only looking to destroy their culture to forcibly assimilate them to your more obedient Chinese culture. So you gotta hide these camps from the public eye as much as possible, but if word does get out, we gotta make sure our bases are covered. So instead of just calling them outright concentration camps, we gotta put some makeup on it. Re-education centers? Re-education centers, transformation centers. So you start building, but how do you build these camps, you may ask? Just like a prison. Surround it in barbed wire, add watchtowers along the perimeter, flood it with even more cameras than the city, and make it look very dark and dreary to crush their spirits. Unlike a prison, since our goal is to re-educate them, we gotta have some brainwashing rooms, classrooms, where we can teach them the proper way to be an obedient citizen. One more thing to keep in mind is that there's a good amount of these outsiders in Xinjiang, around 9 million people. That's a lot of people to potentially keep in these camps, so we gotta make sure we build these as big as possible all over the region. Since most of these people aren't necessarily violent offenders yet, you can get away with squeezing 10 of them to a room and making them share one toilet on the ground to be as efficient with your real estate as possible. And don't worry, yes, this is gonna cost a lot of money to build and maintain, but just remember how important Xinjiang is to us. Once these camps are open for business, it's time to start busing people in. Keep your requirements for detaining people for education and training very loose. Oh, you're worried you won't be able to arrest people before they commit a crime? Relax and just take a page out of the popular Tom Cruise movie Minority Report and use the justification of pre-crime.
I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks and Donald Dubin that was take place today, April 22nd.
重要的问题，我从一个走向犯罪边缘的一个人，我回到了正常的社会状态，成了一个遵纪守法的公民。
So you have the camps up, you got the pre-criminals in, but how do you actually re-educate them? We basically want to turn these prisoners into docile, obedient, and loyal citizens, which entails making sure we break their spirit to prevent any retaliation or extremism and assimilating them into our culture.
You gotta break them. You gotta break them like dogs. Break them. Yeah, break them like dogs.
So just create a how-to guide for the people running these camps around this goal. Of course, you want to do all the typical stuff you find in a prison, controlling their every movement, preventing escape, really maintaining that atmosphere of hopelessness to break their spirit, but assimilating them into our culture is gonna take some more work. You can't feel a part of a culture if you don't speak the native tongue, so make them learn Mandarin. Replace their faith and culture with learning about Chinese culture.
Then they switch from Uyghur, their mother tongue, to Chinese lyrics, written by President Xi Jinping.
Train them to fear and be loyal to the ruling class.
And the replacing of faith and cultural identity with a different loyalty. I love the Communist Party of China, this man has written.
If they're ever released, if they just have a bunch of free time on their hands to ruminate and become vengeful against the government, all your work will be for nothing. So you gotta make sure they're able to stay busy by focusing on their labor if they ever get out. So train them on how to do very entry-level jobs. And lastly, but certainly not least, while you have all these people captured, you might as well use them as cheap labor. If you have any prisoners that aren't complying, you know what to do. Get the system up and running, scale up to 1.8 million prisoners since 2017, and you, sir, have just created a successful network of concentration camps. But with 1.8 million people, the friends and family of that 1.8 million people, everyone involved in the project, and the power of the internet and satellite imagery, word will eventually get out about your camps and how inhumane they are, and how we shouldn't do business with China because of their human rights violations. How are you going to handle that? Now obviously, we don't care about what the world thinks about us, but we can't afford to lose any business, so once word does get out, you gotta suck up your pride and control the narrative. At first, see if you can just delete and deny away any evidence from the internet.
As soon as we began to document the re-education centers, there was Chinese government officials deleting what we were finding.
If that doesn't work and the story starts picking up traction around the world, it's time to take a page out of your neighbor's playbook, North Korea, and put on a show. Select one of the camps you built to act as a showpiece for the world. Get rid of those Orwellian watchtowers, slap on a new coat of paint, and add in some recreational stuff. Only keep your best, most re-educated prisoners there and move the rest to other camps. Dress up your prisoners in knockoff Adidas tracksuits and let a select few journalists in while closely watching over them to make sure they don't ask too many questions. Control and schedule everything they see and train your staff to know exactly what to say.
It isn't a place where people have to come, obey the rules, stay until you allow them to leave. Sound more like a prison, even if it's a prison in which you can do some art.
你指的监狱是这个地方，你觉得这个监狱有画画的监狱吗？我不知道你说的监狱是什么样的监狱。
Whatever you do, just make sure people look happy and that they're willing to be there. Even though most people won't believe the charade, that's not the point. The point is to get as many conflicting viewpoints out there to blur the perception, to instill just a tiny bit of doubt in the back of people's minds about what's really going on. With 1.8 million people, you're eventually gonna have some whistleblowers, but there's a very simple solution to this. Even if they're able to get out of the country to tell their story, they probably have family that are still in China that you have on record. So just kidnap their family to scare the whistleblowers into silence.
6 days after I talked, my sister and my aunt both got abducted on the same day as a retaliation for my activism.
You don't think it was a coincidence?
I don't think so.
And boom, in one somewhat swift move that did take a couple of years but is still pretty impressive in the grand scheme of things, you've gained a tighter grip on the territory that's vital to your quest of world domination, and you've got those pesky outsiders under control while you're re-educating them into more obedient members of society.
Have you been convicted of a crime?
我没有犯罪，我就是犯了错。
And don't worry, if for some reason a few years passes by and they just don't seem to be getting it, well, I'll just leave it at that. Welcome to the Watch the End Club. It's kinda stupid that I have to say this, but I do not support these things. But if you want to change something, it helps if you understand what you're changing and where the people you're disagreeing with are coming from, because if you don't understand where they're coming from, what do you end up with? The war on drugs, fail. The war on terror, fail. The war on alcohol, also known as prohibition, fail. So yeah, that was my rationale.
He does a lot of solid work. Very good use of his talent. And this next clip, we're going to set it up like this. We need to understand a little bit about the psychology of the groups that are taking these actions historically. When there's a communist revolution and some people are rising up and then taking all these other people out, tens of millions of people in those cases.
Back to the time of the
it's something we should learn about. And if those ideas are now moving international, like the Soviet idea, as opposed like the Nazis were National Socialism and the Soviets were international communism. So there is a goal, has been a goal for a long time for international communism to kind of go international. And now you're seeing the spread of it. So if we get down to some of the ideas that seed communist and socialist takeovers around the world, maybe we could recognize it in our own environment and prevent ourselves from going down that slippery slope any further. Thank you for watching this clip from Grand Theft World. You can find us on grandtheftworld.com. You can also see us every Sunday night, 9 p.m., streaming live on rockfin.com/Richard Grove. You can create a free account. You can see the live stream because YouTube's banning it, and we're moving elsewhere.